Over the course of my life, there have been 3 games that I'd say I've been properly obsessed with. Most recently, there was World of Warcraft. I lost years of my existence to that game. I don't play it anymore, for better or worse. Mostly for better. Almost entirely for better. Before that, there was Doom. It's tough to overstate how important Doom was to me, and to gaming as a whole. I didn't have a PC that could handle Doom, I could only play it at a friend's house. After I first played it at his place, he suddenly started getting a lot more visits from me. I would have moved in if I could. Eventually I got a PlayStation, and my absolute top number 1 priority was getting a copy of Doom, which I did. And finally I was able to sate my bloodlust to my demon slaying's heart content. I still regularly play Doom and Doom 2, not to mention many of the awesome fan-made map packs that continue to be made to this day. And some of them aren't even just fan-made. One day I'll do an entire video about my favourite Doom WODs. Anyway, the first game I became truly obsessed with was Street Fighter 2. There was an arcade cabinet in my local fish and chip shop, and I fell in love with it instantly. At that time I was a big fan of martial arts films, but this to me seemed infinitely better. This was a martial arts film you could control, and it had a better cast of characters than any film I'd ever seen. In fact, I came to love the characters just as much as the combat. I even started writing Street Fighter fanfiction. It was terrible. Just imagine how bad you think a 12-year-old's Street Fighter fanfiction would be, then multiply the terribleness by 100. For some reason I made Guile a rich playboy, a character trait which should probably have gone to Ken. And I made Honda a violent brawler who was kicked out of the sumo world after killing someone in a bar fight. And those were the ones I gave the most character development. To be fair, I had absolutely no information to go on other than what I saw in the game and read on the arcade cabinet, which from memory really just consisted of a few special moves. Regardless, I became massively addicted to Street Fighter 2. I spent all my pocket money on it. I even, to my eternal shame, occasionally stole small amounts of money from my mother's purse to feed my addiction. It really is a good thing I never got into drugs, God knows what terrible things I would have done. And it probably says bad things about my character that I still somehow feel more shame about the terrible fanfiction than I do about the theft. In the end, after an agonising wait, Street Fighter 2 came to the Mega Drive. Mean Machines, the Sega magazine I bought every month, did a preview feature on the game, and if you knew how many hours upon hours I spent just rereading those few pages and intently studying the screenshots, you'd have a good idea of just how obsessed I was by the game. After saving my pocket money for what seemed like an eternity, and being the first 24 megabit Mega Drive cartridge it was massively expensive, I managed to get a copy. And, just like when I finally got a copy of PlayStation Doom to call my own some years later, I was overjoyed. I was even more thrilled by the fact that this was the, quote, Special Champion Edition, which featured 4 extra characters I'd never played before, and which, since I was so terrible at the arcade game, I'd never even known were boss characters, as I'd never managed to get that far. For a while, I was in gaming heaven. You're probably wondering what all this has to do with Eternal Champions. Good question. The important thing is, I had an onion on my belt, which was the style at the time. No, wait, that's a different doddering old man. Oh right, Eternal Champions. The thing is, I can't really talk about Eternal Champions without also talking about Street Fighter 2 and my perspective on fighting games. You see, for a while I had a kind of Highlander-esque there can be only one philosophy to fighting games. As far as I was concerned, if it wasn't Street Fighter 2, it was crap. Given that Street Fighter 2 was literally the only fighting game I'd ever played, it's safe to say this wasn't a particularly objective opinion. But hey, this was also the same time period during which I would happily insist that Sega was infinitely better than Nintendo, despite never having played a Nintendo console, so I'll try to cut my younger self some slack. But there was one other fighting game on the Mega Drive that I couldn't ignore. Mean Machines, the magazine I spent so much time poring over when they did a preview of Street Fighter 2, ended up giving the game a record high score of 98 out of 100 in their final review. A few months later, they reviewed Eternal Champions and gave it a 97. At the time, I was childishly proud of the fact that my game, Street Fighter 2, had beaten this new pretender to the throne. But it had only beaten it by the tiniest of margins, so maybe I should check it out sometime? And eventually I did. I didn't buy it when it was new. It was another 24 megabit cartridge and pretty expensive, but I did get it on sale a year or so later. And what did I make of it at the time? Well, in all honesty, it didn't have a very strong impact on me. I enjoyed it for sure, but I remember finding it brutally difficult, and I think I ended up getting about as much enjoyment from the stage fatalities as I did from the actual gameplay. When it came to fighting game action, I was still happy to stick with Street Fighter 2. Now, more than 25 years later, I still love fighting games, but my tastes have broadened considerably. I can now freely acknowledge the existence of fighting games that aren't Street Fighter. I even enjoy many of them. Will I enjoy Eternal Champions? Let's find out. This is one of those games that messes around with the Sega logo, and in fact, it may be the most creative of them. Every time you turn the game on, a random character comes out and beats up the logo using their own particular brand of violence. I love it. The title screen is fine, I guess. All the playable characters are here, looking kind of like a bunch of rejected Avengers. The music is also okay, not the most memorable theme, but it sets the mood well enough. There's some scrolling text that gives you the rundown on the story, and I actually quite like the narrative elements of this game, despite the fact they're rather minimal. Or perhaps it's because they're minimal that I like the story. So many fighting games these days are just so over the top and confusing with their storylines, but the premise here is simple, if a little outlandish. Basically, the balance of the cosmos has been thrown off due to the untimely deaths of 9 individuals throughout human history. The eponymous Eternal Champion, an entity comprised of the combined spirits of the world's greatest martial artists, has the power to grant one of these individuals a second chance at life and an opportunity to fulfill their destiny, which will restore balance to the universe. So he's holding a tournament to determine which of the 9 is most worthy of that second chance. Okay, it's not exactly great literature, but it gives the characters a motivation, and more importantly, it allows for a great diversity of characters from different time periods. There's a caveman, there's a cyborg, there's a gangster from the 20s, there's a vampire from the Vietnam War for some reason that I can't quite remember. There are in-game biographies that explain all that stuff, but before I mess around with that, or with any of the options and different game modes, I'm just going to dive into the main single-player story mode and see how I do. I remember this story mode being brutally difficult, so I don't hold high hopes of making much progress. I also remember that there was one character that seemed to have an easier time dealing with AI opponents, so I pick him. It's Larson, the aforementioned gangster. From memory, he had a jump kick that the AI seemed oddly susceptible to, so let's see how it goes. Not well. But hey, I'm still reacquainting myself with the controls, and I can't really remember many special moves, so let's see how I do second time around. Okay, also not well, but at least this time I win a round. But seriously, this game is tough, at least by my standards. Even as a kid, when my reflexes were at their peak, it took me a hell of a lot of effort to have any success with this game. I did manage to finish the story mode with Larson, but it took months. And after a while, I finished it with 1 or 2 other characters, but I never managed it with the rest. Look, I'll be honest, I joke about being terrible at games, except mostly they're not jokes, they're the stone cold truth. But when it comes to fighting games, there's a whole new dimension to my crappiness. I talked about how much I love Street Fighter 2 and how much I played it, but even with all that enthusiasm and all that playtime, I barely improved at it. Add to that inherent crappiness the achingly slow reflexes and befuddled brain of advanced age, and you've got a recipe for fighting game disaster. And I do think this fighting game in particular is a difficult one, especially given there are no difficulty options for the story mode. So it's no surprise that I lose the third match as well. Still, I'm kind of disappointed. I remember well that the last boss is exponentially harder than any of the fights that come before him, so if I'm getting thoroughly destroyed in the first battle, I really can't imagine that I'm going to have even the slightest chance against the Eternal Champion himself. In fact, at this point I'm doubting that I'm going to be able to reach him. Oh well, I might as well go back to the main menu and try some of the other modes. Maybe with a bit of training I'll regain some of my confidence. Except there doesn't seem to be any way to quit out. Am I missing something? I try every button combination but nothing works. I guess I have to reset. At least that gives me a chance to see some of the other characters destroying the Seagull logo. It's the same guy. I'll try again. Really? The same guy? I know it's random, but what are the odds? And again, I know there were other characters that did this. Or do I? Am I confabulating? Is my memory that bad? No, surely not. I assume it's something to do with the way this emulator works. Still, there's not much I can do about that, so I'll have a look at all the characters in regular combat instead. There's Shadow, the Japanese ninja assassin, and the only character who comes from the current time period. Well, I say current, the game's over 25 years old now, so she's basically from ancient history. I always considered her the weakest character. She seems to have a pretty short range and feels kinda clunky to use. I wouldn't take my opinions on fighting game tier lists at all seriously though. There's Rax, a kickboxing cyborg from the future. You've already seen this guy kicking my ass when I tried the story mode. He's one of the stronger characters and one of the most fun to play. I may have finished the game as him when I was a kid, but honestly I can't be sure. There's Blade, a bounty hunter from slightly less far in the future than Rax. Another solid character with good range on his basic attacks, which honestly seems to be the most important trait in this game. Next up is Jetta, a circus performer from the late 19th century. She moves notably faster than most of the other characters, but is hampered by her lack of range. Then there's Slash, a caveman from prehistory. I'd make a joke about Guns N' Roses, but Mean Machines did that in their review of the game, so I've been beaten to it by a quarter of a century. He's another strong character, helped by the fact that he has a sturdy weapon in a game where range is important. This is Trident, a resident of Atlantis from 100 BC. According to his in-game biography, his martial art of choice is capoeira, which was famously developed by African slaves in Brazil well over a millennium after Trident existed. Still, I guess an anachronistic fighting style is probably not the most unrealistic thing about this guy. One of the most powerful characters in the game, he was the second one I managed to finish the game with way back when. Here's Xavier, a warlock who was burnt at the stake around the time of the Salem witch trials, and good for him for challenging gender stereotypes. He was possibly my favourite character back in the day, mainly because I was quite keen on wizards and mysticism and that sort of thing, and his fighting style is rather fun. Midnight, and that's Night with a K at the start, Mortal Kombat would be proud, is a vampire from the 60s. Apparently he was a biochemist employed to develop a super virus that would win the Vietnam War for America, but in the end he decided not to be evil and was thrown into a vat of his own chemicals by the bad guys. And that's why he's a vampire now. Makes as much sense as most video game narratives, I guess. He's almost as fast as Jetta, but for some reason I never played him much. And finally, there's Larson, who I completely failed to win a fight as earlier. He's a gangster, but like a good one, who was killed by his colleagues. All the characters in this game are ostensibly on the side of good, even the ones with a shady past. There are no villains as such amongst the roster, they're all just victims of fate who were killed before they could alter the destiny of the world for the better. These days, fighting games boast rosters with dozens and dozens of characters, and one with only 9 would have to do something really, really special to get people interested. But back then, 9 was, well, fine. I was perfectly happy with the idea of the Mega Drive version of Street Fighter 2 having only 8 playable characters, and when I found out there were going to be 12, I was ecstatic. And actually, I still don't have any complaints with the characters in Eternal Champions. Sure, there aren't many of them, relatively speaking, but they're a diverse bunch, not only in their backgrounds but also in their fighting styles and abilities. All of them play very differently, and although I've said that some characters feel weaker or stronger than others, in practice the difference isn't too great. Okay, time to check out the training modes. The fact that there are training modes in a fighting game of this vintage is quite remarkable, but ultimately they're not all that appealing. There's a mode where you have to destroy a small sphere before it hits you, which doesn't serve much purpose other than testing your reflexes. There's another sphere-based mode where you just beat up a sphere that can be set at various heights, or to move up and down. And there's a hologram battle, which is not really different to a simple versus match, except you get a score at the end, and your opponent flickers in a way that is extremely irritating. In fact, I'm guessing there's a good chance the opponent won't be visible once I upload this to YouTube, as frame rate differences often mess up flickering sprites. There's also the battle room, which adds traps and hazards to the battle arena. This might be fun for a little while, but I find it just ends up detracting from the combat. There are also speed settings that can be applied to all game modes, and they make a hell of a difference. The gameplay is frenetic on the fast mode and lethargic as hell on the slow mode. I can see the appeal of the higher speed, but even my befuddled brain finds the slow mode to be a damn sight too sluggish. Well, while I'm just messing around with stuff, I might as well show off the fatalities. I like to think of myself as a mature child, but like a lot of people in my peer group, I took a grisly delight in Mortal Kombat's fatalities, even though I found the game kind of disappointing otherwise. Eternal Champions went a slightly different route with its fatalities. Instead of inputting commands once the fight is won, in this game a fatality will occur if the defeated fighter happens to land in a specific spot on the ground. Each stage has its own fatality, and on the whole I found them more appealing and interesting than Mortal Kombat's. I'm using the Steam emulator's rewind feature here. It makes it a whole heap easier to demonstrate the fatalities. It sure beats redoing the whole fight if I get the placement wrong, and you really do have to be precise. The difference in execution makes these fatalities feel very different to those of Mortal Kombat. In that game, fatalities allowed you to demonstrate your dominance over your opponent and your ability to memorize a series of controller inputs, which amongst my circle of friends was considered a valuable skill. In this game, the fatalities are basically random, as it's nigh on impossible to maneuver your opponent in such a way that a fatality is likely, as the positioning requirements are just too finicky. Eternal Champions fatalities are more like cool Easter eggs, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, as it makes them seem more awe-inspiring when they do happen. On the whole, I think Mortal Kombat's fatalities were more satisfying, but these are good too. And there's still a childish part of my brain that finds blood and gore inherently cool. Okay, I've got some practice in, I've messed around with all the different characters, it's time for me to go back and have another crack at the story mode. I'm going to give Slash a try. His basic high punch attacks seemed pretty effective when I was practicing, basically because it's not so much a punch as it is a wild swing with his club. So, can I do any better? Nope, this time it's Larson kicking my ass. But I didn't get totally demolished that time, so I'll give it another go. And sigh, another loss, but I feel like I'm making progress. Maybe next time. Hurrah! Finally, a victory! Admittedly, I won both rounds with a time over, but that's good enough for me. So, it's on to Blade. Can I make it 2 in a row? No. No, I cannot. And, oh yeah, in this game, if you lose a match, you don't just get to continue, at least not if you've managed to get past the first fight. Nope, you go backwards. So, now I'm fighting Larson again. And I lose. Awesome. I'm seriously wondering how I ever managed to finish this game, even when I was in peak form. At least I've got a bit more experience against Larson, so I should be able to beat him again, right? Wrong. I give up, or at least I give up on Slash. I'll have one more attempt, this time as Xavier, who according to consensus is the most noob-friendly character. It's just a shame then that I'm way beyond noob territory, and well into whatever lies beyond. But, miracle of miracles, I managed to win the first match without losing once. Things are looking up. And things are looking even more up as I managed to win the second match as well. The third though, crap, down I go. And what's this? Oh joy, you don't just go back one fight when you lose, you go back 2. So I'm basically back to the start. Welp, as you might have seen in my previous videos, what little pride I have left is very easily cast aside. It's obvious now that the only way I'm going to be able to show the last boss is by cheating. And you know what? That rewind feature I used to demonstrate the fatalities is an extremely effective way of cheating at fighting games. All I need to do when I get clobbered like the sack of potatoes I basically am is hit the rewind button, go back a second or two and get in a preemptive strike. George W. would be proud. Is that a reference the youth of today are going to get? That said, do I care? No. So, my foes wilt before my time-shifting abilities, and before long I'm facing the Eternal Champion himself. Okay, the game's been tough so far, but now it becomes brutal to the extreme. The Eternal Champion is a multi-phase fight, but there are not 2 phases that need to be conquered, nor 3, nor even 4. Nope, the Eternal Champion has 5 different forms that need to be beaten, and your health is only partially restored between each fight. Fortunately, at least, the timer doesn't count down for this battle. In his first form, he has the ability to become completely invincible, which is fair, I guess. He can also explode into a barrage of destructive energy projectiles. Good stuff. Without cheating, I don't even make it past this first form, which honestly doesn't surprise me. When you lose, he tells you that you're going to be returned to your death and that the universe is basically screwed. Maybe if he'd pulled his punches a little more, we wouldn't be in this mess. And then the game's over. When you lose to the Eternal Champion, you just don't go back a few fights, you go back all the way. All the way to the Sega logo, in fact. And it's a miracle. This time a character other than Blade shows up. I knew I wasn't misremembering things. It was worth losing just for that. Of course, I have save states, and since I've been cheating my ass off, there's no way I'm going to fight my way back to the Eternal Champion. And this time, I'll be rewinding my way to victory. So, the boss's other 4 forms are based on the animals in the windows of his chamber. Each one slightly alters the champion's form and gives him new abilities. And of course, he gets a whole new health bar with each one. First up, I get the shark. His fin attack is easy to block, but it really needs to be avoided as the chip damage will wear you down pretty quick. Next up is Tiger form, which allows the champion to increase his speed and spin around like an angry ball of teeth and claws. A lack of projectile attacks makes this form kind of easy to cheese though, and I defeat it without rewinding just by spamming my heavy attack. The next form, Dragon, does have a projectile attack however, and it also augments the champion's attacks with fire. Nasty stuff. Finally, Eagle form. This is possibly the easiest form, and its most often used ability does nothing except harmlessly push you backwards. This might be a cunning stratagem if the timer was a factor, but in this fight it's not. So, before long, victory is mine. Am I not awesome? Don't answer that. I get a brief spiel about balance being re-established, and then I'm whisked off back to my own time period with the chance to evade death. The champion then explains how Xavier's extended life changed history. Basically, he locks into the ability to travel through time, which is kind of fitting since it was my ability to rewind time that allowed him to prevail. and then he travels through time fixing key events. Now, if time travel fiction has taught me anything, it's that trying to alter fate usually doesn't work out well. Are you sure you did the right thing, Mr. Eternal Champion? Actually, since his whole plan was based on the concept of altering history, I guess he's fine with it. Okay, that's the game done. Well, with one character at least, and a whole heap of cheating. But that's enough for me, which is good, because I suspect I could keep playing from now until the heat death of the universe and not be able to complete the story mode legitimately. Really though, the story mode is only a small part of fighting games. All it adds in this game is a massively overpowered boss and a bit of text that tells you what happened to your character. Don't get me wrong, when I was a kid I cared a great deal about that bit of text. I'm the guy who wrote Street Fighter fanfiction when he was 12 after all. I cared about the characters of fighting games and their stories, and the different endings of this game represented the most important parts of those stories. And I didn't have the internet back then. If I wanted to know what happened to the characters when they won, there was only one way to find out, and it was a way that was beyond my skill in most cases. I never found out what happened to Midnight, or Jetta, or Shadow. I only just found out what happened to Xavier 25 years after I played the game. Maybe I'll go back one day and cheat my way to victory with them as well. Or, more likely, maybe I'll just go look it up on the internet. I'm sure there's a wiki about it somewhere. So it's time for my final thoughts. Is Eternal Champions worthy of comparison to Street Fighter 2? Does it deserve the 97 out of 100 it scored in Mean Machine Sega 25 years ago? Well, as it happens, the editor of Mean Machine said a year or two later that they may have gone a bit overboard with that score, which made Eternal Champions the second highest rated Mega Drive game of all time. Personally, I'd say that yes, with the benefit of hindsight, it doesn't deserve a score that high. But relative to the time it was released, that's a tougher call. It was definitely the second best fighting game on the system. In terms of playability and variety, it kicked the pants off Mortal Kombat. So if you really liked fighting games, you could make the case it deserved to be the second highest rated game. More objectively though, no, 97 is probably too high. But I do think it warrants comparison to Street Fighter 2 and makes a good companion to that game. But how does it stand up compared to the fighting games of today? That's not easy to answer. The gameplay of fighting games has been tweaked and refined to an excruciatingly high degree of polish and nuance. Eternal Champions is a little lacking in those elements. It occurred to me while playing that it actually feels more like a particularly sophisticated beat-em-up along the lines of Streets of Rage than a fighting game of the modern era. In the fighting games of today, animations flow into each other perfectly, and the action is fine-tuned to be responsive, balanced, readable, and fair. Well, at least in the good modern fighting games. Eternal Champions can't quite match that. I think one of the main problems is that the characters seem to have quite large hitboxes that don't necessarily relate perfectly to the frames of their animations. Quite often I got hit by attacks that I thought should have whiffed. Furthermore, it seems kind of arbitrary which attacks get priority. This means that rather than each character having a set of different attacks that are all useful in different circumstances, you just need to find which of your attacks are overpowered and then just spam the hell out of them. This is exacerbated somewhat by the not particularly sophisticated AI. It's fine for 25 years ago, but it does feel more like you're trying to figure out an AI algorithm rather than fighting a real human being. And again, this is not a problem that is entirely gone away, even now. Alas, being a crotchety old curmudgeon, I don't have any friends. Well, none who are into fighting games at least. So I couldn't really try out the multiplayer. I do remember having fun with it as a kid, but I only ever really played it with my friends when Street Fighter 2 started wearing thin, and that didn't happen often. As for the graphics, well, I'd say it looks good, damn good in places. The backgrounds are varied and vibrant, and the character sprites are large and well drawn. The animations are a little less smooth than Street Fighter 2 and not always as pleasing to the eye, but they work well enough, and again there's a good variety to them. On the whole, it's technically impressive for the Mega Drive, and while the appeal of the overall aesthetic will be a matter of opinion, to me it mostly looks great. The music is largely good, but there's only one killer track in my opinion, and that's the one for Blade Stage. It rocks. The sound effects, on the other hand, are kind of weak, which does diminish the impact of the combat. Still, on the whole it's a good game. I really like the characters and the variety of the fighting styles, even if the movesets within those styles are not particularly well balanced. But unlike the last 3 games I looked at, I can't necessarily recommend playing this one unless you're a real fan of fighting games and this one passed you by. Mainly that's to do with the fact that the fighting game genre has evolved in some pretty profound ways, and unlike an early platformer, an early fighting game tends to feel a little obsolete. We've just come so far. Well, it's time for me to retire to my study with a weighty tome and a snifter of port, so that's it for now. Next time I'll be looking at another very different type of game, and this one nearly tore apart my family. Intrigued? No? Oh well, until then, get off my lawn.